Philosophers talk to our times. A brief history of Myddle. Natural history. The reader says it in Margins of Philosophy, his essay Note of a Note. He talks about how space and time are ultimately riveted together by a very small word in Greece, hama, which he translates as togetherness, all together, falling together. And he points out that this argument, which is never nuanced, allows you to both distinguish space and time, but make them complementary one to the other. It is all about their togetherness, how they hang together, whether one can come after another. This is in the context of an argument about the now and Aristotle. So the now is not a part of time, but it is a part of time. The nows are unable to hang together. They can never directly follow one another and become the numbering number for movement. But throughout this argument, there is always an affinity that the line that you can draw on paper, the line that you walk, your movement line, is somehow in accord with the line of time, the steady passage of the day. It is silently registered by this word and how it models and forces the argument to make one set of choices than the other. And so Western metaphysics is caught up in that dialogue that will last all the way to Kant and beyond, that space and time are somehow corollaries of each other, that one is the inner sense and one is the outer sense. Time is the way our minds then fashion the world, to bend it into space, to force lines. I'm on Kant, of course. And he calls the argument a clavicle, a collarbone, a key argument, something that is silently there. Now, within the reader's argument in Margins of Philosophy, he is saying that Heidegger, of course, doesn't really escape this particular move, this particular drive to a continuity that is created within a silent algebra of Western metaphysics, a silent algebra of the word time and its affinity to space. And the reader is wanting to think of some other way you could do it. And that's all jolly good and dandy. But of course, in a sense, I would certainly argue that there is nothing wrong with organic time. There are worse things than organic time. Deleuze certainly says that in cinema. Space-time is not such an awful idea. There is a sense in which space and time can be understood as an affinity, as long as that isn't all that time is, as long as that isn't all that space is. It could be pulled in different directions, seen otherwise. And yet, there is a sense that the two are caught up in the middle of the other, of another, and infer each other. Which, of course, is the point of relativity as far as I understand it. But it is the fact that they are in another. And that leads back to my argument of yesterday, which was slightly more obscure than I meant it to be, because the argument was more complicated than I thought it was going to be. It often is. I am composing these, streams of consciousness. And when you get home and look at it and go, oh, wow, that was a bit stronger than I meant it to be. Or, as in the case of yesterday, that was a bit more confused. I usually avoid it because I'm doing things that I can summarise quite quickly into 10, 20-minute pieces. But this series is slightly different because it is more thinky. But anyway, that's beside the point. The point about another is that it is always a clavicle. It's always holding together elements that otherwise might be seen as disparate. It is the sense then that the middle is giving itself and gives itself in a preposition. So yesterday, in the context of Bishop Berkeley, I understand Bishop Berkeley as the supreme philosopher of the middle of another. He understands that perceptions exist only as perceptions, as they are in the middle of another, that isn't quite one of them, but is an idea akin to them. which is of course the idea of your mind. And likewise, your mind exists only as each perception is always in the middle of another perception. The mind is the container of perceptions as each automatically implode, shuffle, whatever word you want to use. I think implode is a better word. Into the next and into the next. And those anothers are distinct but highly complementary. One another creates the other. They're not in a dialectic so much as in a position, each defined through what the other is, each defined in the middle of itself, in relation to the other, and that all together then form a philosophy of the middle of another. And that's fine. It kind of works as a description of what perception is and the weirdness of perception, the weirdness of having an idea that is fully mine but fully feels beyond me, and then having a second idea that I never perceive, the idea of myself. I never learn about, but I can only learn about through the way that the perceptions tumble one to the other. I can only learn about through the fact that I do feel their alienacy, their otherness from me. It works, why not? Berkeley, though, has, of course, philosophical problems the minute he wants to go beyond that. The minute he wants to talk about God, now, within the Berkeley system, within the way that that the middles resolve, Berkeley wants to move very quickly to talking about in the middle with another. That with another is God. And he wants to have God as directly inferred from the middles of perception and the middle of another. And he does it with indecent haste. All he says is, you can't explain, I'm not going to explain, I'm not going to try to explain, nobody could ever explain in the middle of another, therefore we must have something beyond us, God. And that God, he wants to say, is the infinite mind, the infinite creative mind, and that we must learn about God's purpose through the world itself. And yet, that purpose, the purpose he wants you to learn about, is almost invariably moral, and has no way of explaining why it is using this slightly obscure way to reveal itself. It's just God's purpose, one of the things that we learn. And the effect is, within the Berkeley argument, the another of God, the in the middle with another of God, is never something I am actually with. I can't really learn about God. I can just learn about what God does in me. And there is no another. The another is merely another of failure. It's not anything I'm in any sort of relationship with. It is not like the middle of another, as it is within me, where the two are in some sort of reciprocal relation, one feeding into the next, one caught up within the next. Oh no, this is a juxtaposed another, just saying, well, there must be something else. And Berkeley's unwillingness is because he wants to because he's not interested. He's not interested, really, in talking about any other position. If you can contrast it with Spinoza, Spinoza will talk about attributes as in the middle in another. You're always caught up within the attribute, but also caught up within other modes. That goes back to my point yesterday about the positioning of perception within Spinoza. That perception is very firmly the middle of another, but that is understood as the way causes has impacted upon, or a cause has impacted upon something. And you have to remember, within causes, within Spinoza, causes are almost always, I think, complicated, multiple. It's effects that are simple. The middle of another, therefore, can have a simple perception with multiple causes, but it will understand it as a one thing. And that means that Spinoza ends up with a very nuanced position, where exactly how the middle of another and its relationship with its own other and the middle in another relate is the topic of ethics. How the different anothers work. How once it actually has a perception of a thing, in the case of the animals or plants actually, the middle of itself, the perception of itself actually existing, the idea of another having a body actually existing, and the idea in another being a mode are given in the same moment, in the same thought. But Spinoza spends a long time proving that. All the propositions at the beginning of book 2 lead up to it. It's a complicated idea. And that's because he's very aware of the nuance, the problem of the clavicle. The problem of another is its naive innocence. It tends to assume that all anothers are the same another as it is, and they never are. Because the another is patterned by the sense at the middle, by the sense it is in the middle, and the preposition that follows from the middle. The ins, the withs, the throughs, the fors, that make what that another is to itself. How it is hanging together, that define the sense that it is in its own clavicle. And this goes back to something else I said 2 days ago, something like that. About, for me, that issue about what maths you can easily use within philosophy. Now, maths for me, as I said before, is a kingdom in itself. And to pull out more, and while I absolutely understand that it is very justifiable to look upon mathematical concepts and go, wow, that's a way of understanding the world. And to pull out that idea as a concept and use it in your own philosophical rhythm, in your own for your own philosophy. And that is, of course, what a philosopher like Deleuze does, and does often. The problem comes when if people try to understand that concept in terms of the maths from which it appears to be related. Can I put it that way? Because the concept that you have pulled out, you have to distinguish very clearly from the maths from which it came, because the anothers aren't the same. So the world that the way that Deleuze, for instance, understands difference in different repetition, and the world that differential equations, as my father understood them, are clear, very different worlds. And yet, there is always a temptation. For me, there's always a slight suspicion about people when they are reading the Deleuze. They will understand those terms as if they are mathematical. And if they do that, then they are confusing their anothers. I don't know. And I suspect you can easily make an argument that Deleuze doesn't make that confusion. You can do. Why not? But other people do. Including myself. Because when I'm reading concepts like that, I will genuinely get myself caught up trying to reconcile it to the mathematical world in which I live. How does this relate back to the anothers? It relates back to maths is always in the middle of itself. It's a classic kingdom apart. Every mathematical idea, every mathematical formula is always in the middle of in another formula. It's always caught up within an entire fabric of different hypotheses that describe a world that is tangential at best to the world in which we live in. In terms of Spinoza, it's a creation of reason and reason alone. That's on one side. Once you start pulling out a concept, of course, you've pulled out in the middle of another. You've taken that concept and you've put it into something else. And then you're setting it going and getting it moving and getting it moving and getting it moving and moderating it and fiddling with it and playing with it. And the two are utterly, utterly distinct and needs to be kept distinct. And the problem is, if you start to confuse them, as I think often does happen, I shall put it that way, then you leave the path of easy thought, because you are back at playing with Bishop Berkeley. You're trying to understand how these two things have some sort of affinity beyond the initial using one as a model for the other. And I actually don't think that infinities like that can't exist. On the contrary, in the middle with another, the way that philosophy, for instance, and mathematics move off in some sort of tandem, are caught up within each other, is a very, very complicated history in its own right. But it's not something that you can easily do, not something that can be treated lightly. Which is why I like to use examples I understand. And understand very, very, very well. because that allows me to define very clearly where I am, which another I'm dealing with, how the argument is hanging together, how it reflects the argument I'm trying to always make. Because if you don't do that, the temptation to form inadequate ideas becomes absolute and complete. The problem is, of course, with inadequate ideas is that they are heady. They're powerful. They sweep you along. And so you can very quickly move from using maths and the models of maths as a conceptual hunting ground. It's very quick and very easy. And maybe other philosophers, maybe not perhaps for other philosophers, but certainly for me, to move from there to some sort of inadequate idea where you want to confuse what you're doing with actual mathematics. And then you are lost. You are lost in the Berkeley. You're talking about everything as if it was with another. And you're trying to have the value of mathematics for cheap and for free. The point about the concepts that you're pulling out is that they need to be distinct. And once they're in philosophy alone. So I don't do it. And having had a lifetime of teaching mathematics, understanding it to a certain level, I kind of feel I don't need to, because I can always use different sets of examples to illustrate middles. The same has to also be said to be true for quantum mechanics. Why I feel unable to use it as an example is not because it isn't important, but because I don't know that I can form adequate ideas about it. Partially due to lack of understanding on my part, certainly true, but also because I have a sneaky suspicion that in 100 years' time it might look a little different. I'm kind of closer to Roger Penrose, but that's of no consequence to anyone. In a sense, it doesn't matter to anyone what I think. Is it a useful hunting ground for concepts? Maybe, absolutely maybe. But you'd have to be terribly careful cleaning them up and knowing exactly what you're dealing with, what a particle is and how it works, in order to not get yourself lost within the maze of trying to understand, trying to use an idea, and then having it jackknife on one. You'll get very lost in the middle or in another. And what you're always wanting to do is just pull out the concept, clean it up, and then use it for what you want to do. Well, for me, the world is big enough and there are concepts enough. And it is always a danger of philosophy. Clavicles are the way that we think. The setting up of another relationships. The understanding how one idea shifts into another idea. That is the essence of thinking. When Derrida deconstructs Heidegger, he's not destroying the notion of space-time. On the contrary, he's merely pointing out its limitations. That it isn't quite what it thought it was. That other things can always be said. And that is certainly true. But the clavicle itself is holding an argument together. The story then is not to dismiss them, but to work out how they are working, silently operating. Whether that operation is giving you a simple world, or whether it is forcing you, as Berkeley was forced to do, just simply to assert things in order to hide the gaps within your argument, the fact that you're not interested in established things, the fact that it's actually more complicated than you thought. And within thinking, within middles, that it is always easy to hide the complexity by appealing towards something like a middle with another or a middle through another. They exist, you see, as arguments, and they are not. In fact, ultimately, the middle, what I would call the middle with another, is very close to the third type of knowledge, which I'll come back to on a different setup. And so it is a very powerful form of knowledge, but it is also a very powerful way to get yourself utterly confused and lost and eat the lotus root. Because you can suddenly think you've solved a problem and you've solved no sort of problem. That's the danger of clavicles. It's the danger of stepping beyond your own discipline, stepping beyond what you actually really know in detail. You can do it. It is very creative. Berkeley manages to defy all of perception by doing it, and does it very well. And yet, it hits the buffers, it hits a limitation. If you try to because it will tempt you always to pull it out and create endless adequate ideas. Middles are complicated things. Thinking how you are in the middle and what exactly you are in the middle of matters, because they create their own realities, and it is all too easy to breed monsters in the end.